recently I was listening to some news about the eclipses. There was an eclipse which went across North America on the 8th of April, and there was a path of totality. There was a path on the map of the American continent which showed all the places that a total solar eclipse could be viewed, where the moon would completely blot out the sun. Now this path, a really interesting path, it went through 7 cities by the name of Nineveh, which got the Bible enthusiasts going, beginning from Mexico, and it went out through the United States to Canada. Now, this path of the eclipse's totality at least, because there are other parts of the country where the eclipse could be viewed as a partial eclipse, but not as a total eclipse. This path formed an X with another path from 7 years previously, because there was an eclipse through North America, went the other way, back in 2017. It was in August in that year, August the 21st, I believe. And this recent one was, as I say, the 8th of April. In Australia, it was, well, the timing would have been the 9th of April, but over in the United States, where they could see total eclipse, it was the 8th of April. And this X shape has an intersection point. And I remember looking at one news report, and it said that that intersection point was over a particular city in Illinois called Carbondale, I believe. Now, Carbondale was a city, is a city that has been quite significant as a place where people can go to get abortions, because because it's such a controversial issue over in the United States, and it's been gathering momentum, the issue of abortion, since the overturning of Roe versus Wade in 2022. And I dare say it'll probably be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, domestic issues that the next US presidential election will be fought upon. So some people who are seeking an abortion travel from different states to Carbondale or from outlying regions of their state. And it's interesting that the intersection of the two eclipse paths were over there, because it brings up the whole business of sex and how it relates to peacemaking. Now, before the eclipse happened, there was an orgy of speculation online as to what it could possibly mean. A whole spectrum of speculation, all the way to the end of the world. I preferred to sit on the fence and watch what happened and see what happened in the wake of the eclipse. And the next morning I looked at the news feed, and a few things had happened. The Vatican, the Pope, had published a document called Dignitas Infinita, which proscribed the transgender ideology for Catholics. It was said by the Pope to be beyond the pale. Donald Trump spoke up and said that the issue of abortion was going to be left to the states, the individual states in the US, to determine, as regards law, even though the Supreme Court had overturned the abortion rights so-called law of Roe v. Wade, which had been enforced for about 50 years. And now it's no longer a constitutionally protected right, although it recently has become in France. Another thing happened was that J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, defied a Scottish ban against so-called hate speech because she is trying to assert that women have an identity and that the whole transgender ideology is opposed to that. So she was being quite outspoken, quite cheeky, quite provocative, and saying that she was ready for the Scottish police to come and arrest her because she was not going to speak in the way that the state was suggesting she should speak. She was not going to use pronouns, etc. Now, you're all probably aware of what a hot issue this all is.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
It's creating a lot of angst for a lot of people. I also noted that there was some transgender related case in Australia as well at that time that was going through the courts. And it seemed that with the passage of the eclipse, and this may just be a coincidence, it may just be a meaningful coincidence, it may be one of those synchronicities that we talked about, where there's a parallelism between what's happening over here and what's happening here. There might be a parallelism between what's happening celestially and what's happening terrestrially. But there would seem to be a humanity, or the collective consciousness of humanity, trying to assess where the limit is. For example, are we to allow transgender athletes to compete in sports freely? For example, somebody who's a biological male and is transitioning to becoming a female, can he compete in women's sport? And it would seem now that the law and the lawmakers around the world are saying, no, that's the line.
There'd be a difference in strength.
Oh yeah, there's a big difference
Absolutely.
in strength. And there's a lot of consciousness that a lot of biological women who've trained very hard for so many years don't have an opportunity to reach the heights of their sport, to reach the top positions as competitive athletes, because it's not fair once a biological male gets into their race or gets into their fight or gets into their weightlifting competition and so on. Now, the whole business of transgenderism is the farthest shore of a big public discourse and conflict that's been going on for a long time. I don't know if it's transhumanism, maybe even a further shore, where people, choose to become another species, like, I identify with being a cat or a giraffe, etc. But let's just say...
When teachers have to put a kitty litter in a classroom.
Oh, there was a case of that where
that's bizarre.
Teachers were asked to introduce a kitty litter into the children's toilets because one child thought that they were a furry person. What I forget the term, but so some of our human family believe that gender is a mutable, changeable thing and totally a social construct, and others believe that there's a substratum, a basis to gender in biology, which should be a given and should be respected. And for traditional religious people, it is most important and sacred to respect that there are biological males and biological females, that there are basically two genders. Now, I don't think any reasonable person would say that there's nothing more to being a female than having two X chromosomes and a set of ovaries and a womb. And there's nothing more to being a male than having an X and a Y chromosome, etc. Because society and gender construct comes into play. But it's another thing altogether to say that the biology has nothing to do with it. That we can work on the biology and change it. Now, it would seem that humanity is reaching a point of limitation here when it comes to the mutability and the interchangeability of gender. There would seem to be, and I'm not giving my opinion, and I'm not trying to divine your opinion, but I'm saying through the world as a whole, there would seem to be a rising consciousness that there's no way around acknowledging that there is a biological basis to gender, even if there is a cultural basis. And it's very important that we do have a clear understanding of sex, of gender, and of human sexuality as well. Because we've reached the somewhat ridiculous situation where a candidate for the Supreme Court in the United States couldn't say, in response to a direct question, what a woman was, because it had to be hedged around with so many qualifications and so on.
Complicated.
It's become really complicated. Maybe it's become too complicated.
I think so too.
To define what a man is and what a woman is.
It's ridiculous. It's outrageous.
But it's causing a lot of people angst, and lots of people are concerned about the mutilation of the human body, and lots of people are concerned about their particular form of libido being marginalised by society. And it's a very interesting, but it's a hot button area.
And the parents that permit these procedures, medical procedures on their children that are too young to make a decision is horrible, I think. And then a lot of these decisions, you can't reverse them once they're done. Yeah,
that's a point of view of a lot of people.
Yeah.
But often those parents, some parents are at odds with their kids. And in some cases, the government comes down on the side of the kids, and the parents have no more parental say over what happens to their kids.
Oh, I hope they're ballistic.
But some parents actually think that they are helping their kids.
No.
Because they're helping them to be the person they want to be and to avoid becoming suicidal, right? So
that's not what I've seen. I've seen a lot of regret.
Right.
A lot of regret.
Right.
That can't be undone.
Now, there are things that are freely talked about and are things that are not so freely talked about. And there's this concept of the Overton window, named after a political scientist, Overton, which says that in any political system and in any political discourse, there are certain things that are acceptable and some things are just too radical and unacceptable and beyond the pale, so we can't really talk about them and they can't be the basis of policy. But I think it's fair to try and push out the boundaries of that Overton window as much as possible, because as I say, people are suffering. And there is a lot to human sexuality that bears on peace education and peacemaking. For example, the human sexual force, the human libido, as Sigmund Freud called it, is a powerful thing. It's such a powerful influence in our lives. And what we do as individuals and societies with our sexuality and sexual force will have repercussions for our political systems, for our culture. Whether we accept this sexual force, how we wrangle with it, how we redirect it, how we sublimate it, will profoundly influence the culture. In the Soviet Union, for example, bourgeois marriage was considered to be an obstruction. They believed in people, well, jettisoning the institution of marriage and being able to freely have sex with whomever they pleased. And the state would educate the children on important things like sex education and other matters as well. But eventually they had to abandon this experiment because society started to break down.
I wonder why.
Now, in the 30s, there was a psychologist, Wilhelm Reich, who was really, he was investigating human sexuality. And he made the claim that the repression of human sexuality could lead to authoritarianism. So he was trying to make a connection between sex and politics, that if human sexuality got too repressed, it could lead to Nazism, fascism, and so on.
End up with a dictator.
And this idea has been very potent. It's influenced a lot of people. It's influenced
Fascists.
the sexual revolution of the 60s. I mean, I think Yoko Ono says somewhere, John Lennon's partner, that World War II might not have happened, or history could have been very different if Hitler had a different set of sexual experiences. So
I don't think he had any, personally.
Now, our world is somewhat polarised, and each political system is somewhat polarised between those who look for the connection between sex and violence.
Mussolini?
In one respect, or in another respect. Mussolini was a fascist, but just get your mind off that for a minute and think that the reason I'm bringing up sex is because we believe that there's a connection between sex and violence, but different groups of our societies look for that connection in different areas. For example, usually those of a more progressive left-wing inclination will think that a lot of the wars have to do with the repression of human sexuality. For example, a traditionalist repressive approach to sex, they might argue, is preventing the spread of sexual freedom around the world. So they make the connection between war and sex. And it goes back to Reich, and it goes back to the sexual revolution of the 60s, where the slogan was "Make love, not war."
And now they're weaponising it.
Well, what does that love mean? That maybe there's a truth in what the hippies were saying, and what the boomer generation was saying there: make love, not war. There's this insinuation that when we go violent and make war, it's because we have repressed our sexuality in some way. We have the wrong attitude to sex, or we're sexually frustrated, or we haven't understood the sex energy. Now, I'm just putting these ideas out there because they motivate people, and therefore the more progressive people, and I'll talk about progressives and conservatives. The more progressive people look at the connection between sex and violence on a macro scale with the wars that are going on in the world. They can make an argument that Hitler, Mussolini, dictators, or Putin, they're all waging a war in order to support a society which tightly controls sex. And they might go back to the Pussy Riots in Moscow, in Russia, and the upsurge of traditional religious values in Russia. Whereas, the West, fighting its proxy war through Ukraine, wants a more liberated environment. They want gay and transgender rights, they want gay marriage and so on. These things won't be allowed and are not being allowed in Putin's Russia. Now, I'm not commenting on what's right in this conflict. I am saying that our attitudes towards sex are an integral part of the judgments we make, one society against another, one civilization against another. A decade or two ago, African states were up in arms that Barack Obama wanted to link foreign aid to them to their willingness to decriminalise homosexuality and introduce gay marriage laws. And since that time, gay marriage laws or same-sex marriage laws have swept the world.
And Michelle has become Michael.
Well, there are all sorts of nutty conspiracy theories around that as well. But
could be true, Thomas. You never know.
So, do you see where I'm going with this? Now, on the other side of this discourse are the more traditionally minded people that also see a connection between human sexuality and violence. But instead of looking out there on the battlefield, they're looking to the intimacy of the human body and the womb and so on. And they're drawing a connection to killing the unborn in the womb. So abortion. And to a contraceptive mentality. And to the mutilation of the body, which happens, the surgical interventions, if somebody is trying to transition from one sex to another. So they see a lot of violence in this. And the first level of violence may be the desire to separate the aspect of sex that has to do with bonding and enjoyment, and from the aspect that has to do with procreation. They see a subtle violence there. The more traditionally, or the more conservative, but maybe traditionally minded is a better expression. And this is all happening, it's a very intimate thing. It's happening in the body and in the bedroom. then no-fault divorce taking over our societies, so that it has become over the decades of my life progressively easier to dissolve the marriage bond. No questions asked, no fault either side. So the sexual impulse is given freer rein. It is no longer, for secular society, confined to the bounds of marriage. Then there's the feminist movement and the changing of the roles of men and women, which, let's face it, in practice, make it difficult to live a traditional life and make it difficult.
Impossible.
Sometimes it puts great strains on a marriage, and sometimes it makes it well nigh impossible to raise children and to care for them adequately, which can lead to a whole gamut of social problems with children that are lacking something. They may have lacked the presence of a mother and a father. They may have lacked good role models. They may have had absent fathers, and this will lead to certain derangements in their lives. But the laws are affecting human sexuality, and human sexuality is in turn affecting the laws. And then we have the big push for abortion, which reached a crescendo in the early 1970s with Roe versus Wade. And for many people, abortion has come to be regarded as the last line of contraceptive defence. They want sex, they believe that they have a right to sexual freedom and sexual pleasure without restriction, and it does not have to be within the bounds of marriage. It does not have to be ordered to raising a family. And so that the connection between the pleasure function and the uniting function or procreative function of sex can be severed. It can be severed with a contraceptive pill and other techniques of contraception. And if none of them have been at play, or if they've failed, then the last line of defence is abortion. Now, this is such a hot political potato, of course. On one side, you've got people clamouring for a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy. On the other side, they're saying it's not that simple. There's a woman and a man, and probably a higher power involved here too. And it shouldn't be that difficult for people to understand that there could be a third presence involved in conception and the creation of life, because when you go down that in vitro fertilisation track, they're all the technicians in the laboratories that are presenting themselves as that third player in the creation of life. In vitro fertilisation and the rest. Artificial reproductive technologies. Beside the man and the woman, there's that aspect.
In some cases that's needed, Thomas. If a couple have been trying for many years and they really want to be parents, I'm all for IVF.
Well, at this point I'm not making a judgment. A lot of people do go down that road, and we should be aware that for the majority of human beings, they have no problem with IVF. From what, but for some human beings there is a problem. And I mentioned some groups of religious. It is it is proscribed.
I don't know why.
So we have to be aware of the full range of opinion here. We're only promoting understanding in the first instance. But I don't want to be disingenuous, because, of course, when you reach a position on these bioethical issues, it will lead to a political action. It will inevitably lead to political action. But it's important that one be properly informed. And that's the first task of peace education, to be properly informed. Because there would seem to be a split in the human consciousness. Well, one thing in common is I think most people see a connection between sex and violence is the antithesis of peace and the peace mentality. But is the main problem the repression of sex, which leads to dictatorship and violent politics, or is it what we do in the womb and in the bedroom, and what we do with our sexuality? Do we commit a violence on ourselves when we engage in different forms of sex? This is a question that you need to ask yourself.
I'm going to say with IVF.
Do we?
There's no violence.
The question goes very deep and it goes very subtle. Do we commit a violence on ourselves if we're going to transition or think we're transitioning from one gender to another? Are we mutilating ourselves? Is it violent? And obviously, to be interested in peace means that we need to be interested in sex, in the sex force, and its proper expression, and what can go wrong with its proper expression. And it's certainly a huge area, and today we've only addressed the tip of the iceberg, but I hope I've connected a few dots here and shown how this too has to be part of our inquiry. Human sexuality has to be part of our inquiry.
It starts when you're young, at home, with your parents, teaching you.
It does.
What's moral and what's immoral.
Yes.
Yeah.
Parents are teaching children all the time.
And the seriousness of it.
Yeah.
And what can happen.
Yeah.
Conception can happen. You've got to be prepared for that.
Yeah.
You know, little things like that.
Yeah.
That's where it starts.
It does.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of parents are confused, and society is generally confused what to teach, what to put in to sex ed. And there's so much outrage in communities about what is being taught in sex education in the schools.
I had a lot of
and
friends.
Understandably so.
A lot of friends, their mother would just give them the birth control pill at the age of 15.
Yeah, some people think
what you need.
that there are easy solutions, but it is a very complex area, and as I say, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We'll have to revisit this at a later time and go into it in greater depths.
Yeah,
but I think
emotional side to it and stuff. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's really important and interesting
Very
too,
serious.
because we've come to think of sex as just something that two bodies can engage in.
No.
Right? It's just at a chemical level. But every time there is sexual interaction, there is emotional interaction.
It brings you closer to
that's
the
right.
person.
And we are.
Sometimes it does.
Well, I think it's naive to think that we're not saying something emotionally when we give our bodies to each other. Do you know what I'm saying? It has an emotional significance. So trying to divorce sex from the emotional and the mental and the spiritual side can lead to a whole host of social problems.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? And then we've got violence, on all fronts, and conflict on all fronts, because sex has been misunderstood. And then where does the peacemaker begin? Because if the peacemaker is only dealing with the symptoms, but the causes are deep down in our attitudes towards sex and love and bringing life into the world, then the peacemaker is going to be hampered in their effectiveness, and we want to empower our peace educators and peacemakers. Talk to you next time.